November 3rd, 1975. 9:47 a.m. Room 318, Russell Senate Office Building, Washington, D.C. The air conditioning hums too loud in the hearing room, a mechanical drone that does nothing to cut the humidity seeping through the building's limestone walls. Outside, autumn rain drums against tall windows, blurring the view of Constitution Avenue. Inside, television lights bake the witness table where CIA Director William Colby sits motionless, his hands folded over a manila folder stamped with red diagonal lines. The object arrives on a silver tray carried by a committee aide wearing white cotton gloves. Senators lean forward. Camera shutters click like insects. Under the lights, the weapon looks almost delicate. A modified Colt 1911 pistol, matte black, with a telescopic sight mounted where no sight should be, and a bulbous suppressor that seems to swallow the barrel. The grip has been customized, wrapped in textured rubber, but it's the loading mechanism that draws the eye, an electric battery pack where the magazine should be, connected by thin wires to something inside the chamber. Senator Frank Church picks up the weapon with both hands. His fingers find the trigger. He aims it at the ceiling, at the Great Seal of the United States embossed in plaster above the witness table. No one laughs. The room has gone absolutely silent except for that air conditioning, that rain, those cameras. This weapon, Church says, his voice carrying the flat precision of a prosecutor, fires a dart smaller than a human hair. The dart dissolves completely within seconds of penetration. It leaves a mark no larger than a mosquito bite. The toxin it delivers causes immediate cardiac arrest. The autopsy shows natural death. Is this correct, Director Colby? Colby nods once. His face reveals nothing. Church lowers the weapon but doesn't set it down. He holds it between them like evidence of original sin. How many times was this weapon used? I cannot answer that question in open session, Senator. Cannot or will not. The former. Rain keeps falling. Someone coughs. A photographer changes film, the mechanical advance loud in the pause. Church finally places the weapon back on the silver tray, but his hand lingers near it, as if proximity to the thing requires witness. What none of them know yet, what won't emerge until documents are declassified in 2007, is that the weapon Church holds represents not a rogue operation, but the terminal point of a program that began 22 years earlier in a very different room, where a very different kind of weapon was being designed to kill in a very different way. The real story doesn't start with a gun at all. It starts with a frozen river, a missing defector, and a shellfish toxin that should not exist in any laboratory on American soil. The official history goes like this. In 1952, the CIA's Technical Services Division began researching methods of assassination that would be undetectable and deniable. This research, conducted under the codename MK Naomi, explored chemical and biological agents that could induce death while mimicking natural causes. The program operated in parallel with MK Ultra, the notorious mind control project. But where MK Ultra sought to manipulate behavior, MK Naomi pursued a simpler objective: elimination without attribution. The public story, the one that appears in congressional testimony and sanitized histories, frames this as a Cold War necessity. Soviet intelligence had developed similar capabilities. The KGB's Laboratory 12, later renamed the Camera, employed poisons ranging from ricin to radioactive compounds. In 1954, KGB defector Nikolai Koklov revealed details of a cigarette case that fired cyanide-tipped bullets, a mechanical marvel of concealed lethality. The CIA, according to this narrative, merely sought parity. Both sides believed they were behind. This is the paradox at the heart of Cold War weapons development. A mirror image of paranoia where each intelligence service convinced itself that the adversary possessed superior capabilities. In Moscow, KGB Chairman Ivan Serov read reports about American developments in synthetic toxins and demanded equivalent programs. In Langley, CIA Deputy Director of Plans Richard Helms received intelligence about Soviet experimentation with biological agents and authorized expanded research. Each side pursued these weapons not from confidence, but from fear of asymmetry, from the terrible possibility that the other side had already perfected what they were only beginning to understand. What was at stake went beyond individual assassinations. The geopolitical calculus of the 1950s and 1960s required tools that operated below the threshold of conventional military action. A car bomb in Beirut could trigger international incident. A sniper in Berlin could spark diplomatic crisis. But a heart attack? A stroke? These were acts of God, beyond the reach of protest or retaliation. The perfect weapon would kill without killing, would eliminate a target while leaving no evidence that elimination had occurred. The key players emerge from deep classification like ghosts gaining substance. Dr. Sidney Gottlieb, chief of the Technical Services Division's chemical branch, oversaw MK Naomi from its inception until 1973. A biochemist with a clubfoot and a weakness for folk dancing, Gottlieb pursued his work with the methodical enthusiasm of a man who believed in better living through chemistry. His deputy, Dr. Nathan Gordon, managed the day-to-day operations at Fort Detrick, Maryland, where the Army's biological weapons program provided cover and facilities for CIA research. On the operational side, William Harvey ran the CIA's Executive Action Program, known internally by the cryptonym Z/Rifle. A former FBI agent with a reputation for both brilliance and excess, he carried 2 pistols and drank martinis at lunch. Harvey understood the practical requirements of assassination in ways that laboratory scientists did not. He needed weapons that an agent could carry undetected through airports, deploy in crowds without attracting attention, and dispose of without leaving forensic traces. Between the scientists and the operators stood the Technical Services Division itself, a bureaucratic entity that existed to transform theory into practice. TSD employed engineers, toxicologists, weapons specialists, and artisans who could disguise a lethal device as a fountain pen or a tube of toothpaste. Their workspaces at Langley occupied windowless rooms in the basement of the original headquarters building, behind vault doors that required 3 separate combinations to open. The weapons they created reflected the strange marriage of lethality and craft. Early attempts focused on contact poisons, substances that could be absorbed through skin. Experiments with dimethyl sulfoxide as a carrier for toxins showed promise but proved unreliable. The poison might take hours to work or might not work at all, depending on variables of skin thickness, perspiration, and body chemistry. Dr. Gottlieb wanted something faster, more certain, more controllable. This is where shellfish toxin enters the story. Saxitoxin, derived from contaminated mussels and clams, blocks sodium channels in nerve cells, leading to respiratory paralysis and cardiac arrest. The toxin operates with elegant efficiency. A few milligrams can kill an adult human in minutes. More importantly for CIA purposes, saxitoxin occurs naturally. A death by saxitoxin could be attributed to food poisoning, an allergic reaction, or simply cardiac failure in an individual with no history of heart disease. By 1960, the Army's Special Operations Division at Fort Detrick had stockpiled 11 grams of saxitoxin, stored in false bottom containers inside locked freezers. CIA records show that Dr. Gottlieb accessed these stockpiles repeatedly between 1960 and 1970, signing for amounts measured in milligrams on forms that have since been declassified. The toxin represented raw potential, the lethal substrate from which a weapon could be fashioned. But delivery remained the central problem. How do you introduce a microscopic dose of toxin into a target's bloodstream without detection, without the target realizing they've been attacked until it's too late to seek treatment? The solution came not from biochemistry, but from mechanical engineering, from a specialist in TSD whose name appears in declassified documents only as Charles S., and whose background included work on compressed gas systems for the aerospace industry. If a small projectile could be fired with enough velocity to penetrate clothing and skin, but with little enough force to avoid injury, it could deliver toxin directly into tissue. The projectile itself would need to be biodegradable, dissolving before medical examination could recover it, and the weapon would need to be silent, compact, and reliable. This was the specification that led to the device Senator. Church would hold in 1975, but the path from concept to prototype took 5 years and consumed resources that would later prove politically indefensible. The development costs alone exceeded $2 million, a figure that appears in budget documents declassified in 1997. More significantly, the program required human testing to verify effectiveness, testing conducted on terminal patients in federal hospitals who were never informed that their final months were being used to calibrate a weapon. What was really happening behind the walls of Fort Detrick and in the basement laboratories at Langley bore little resemblance to the sanitized version that would later appear in congressional testimony. The heart attack gun, as it came to be known in media coverage after the Church Committee hearings, represented the terminal evolution of a program that began with crude experiments in lethal dosing and progressed through increasingly sophisticated delivery mechanisms. The declassified technical specifications, released in 2007 under Freedom of Information Act pressure, reveal a weapon of surprising sophistication. The modified Colt 1911 frame housed a compressed gas cylinder charged to 3,000 psi. When triggered, the gas propelled a flechette, a dart made of frozen water and saxitoxin, through a rifled barrel at approximately 100 meters per second. The telescopic sight wasn't for long-range accuracy, but for precise placement on the human body. CIA memoranda specify target zones: the neck, the thigh, the buttocks, anywhere with substantial blood flow and minimal protective tissue. The flechettes themselves represented a masterpiece of lethal engineering. Each dart measured 2.5 millimeters in length and 0.5 millimeters in diameter. The frozen water served as both projectile and carrier, maintaining structural integrity during flight but dissolving rapidly upon impact with warm tissue. The saxitoxin, suspended in the ice matrix, would be released directly into subcutaneous tissue and bloodstream. Depending on dosage and placement, death could occur in as little as 30 seconds or could be delayed for several minutes, allowing the target to move away from the shooter before collapse. CIA documents describe testing protocols that read like systematic murder. Fort Detrick maintained a population of large mammals, pigs primarily, chosen for their physiological similarity to humans, on which various dosages and delivery methods were evaluated. One memo dated August 1965 and classified top secret no foreign until 2008 details a test series in which 57 pigs were shot with progressively refined versions of the flechette gun. The early failures are documented with clinical precision: projectiles that failed to penetrate, toxin doses insufficient to ensure death, delivery systems that caused visible tissue damage. By test 43, the system achieved what the memo terms optimal parameters, consistent penetration, minimal visible trauma, and death within 2 minutes in 95% of trials. But animal testing could only reveal so much. The transition to human trials remains one of the most controversial aspects of MK-Naomi, and one about which documentation remains sparse. What exists comes from peripheral sources, hospital records subpoenaed during later investigations, testimony from medical staff who were not informed of the true nature of their participation, and cryptic references in CIA memoranda that speak of clinical validation without elaboration. The clearest window into this phase comes from a 1966 document recovered from the personal papers of Dr. Nathan Gordon after his death in 1991. Gordon kept a diary, portions of which were declassified in 2011. The entry for March 17, 1966 reads, "Obtained consent forms from 3 terminal cancer patients at Bethesda Naval Hospital for experimental pain management protocol. Administered test dose of agent KK7 via ice matrix flechette to patient SM03. Time to effect 94 seconds. Cardiac arrest attributed to disease progression. System validated for deployment. Agent KK7 was the internal designation for toxin prepared according to specifications developed at Fort Detrick. Patient SM003 was a 58-year-old male with stage 4 lung cancer. He died believing he was helping to test a new form of palliative care. Instead, he became the first human being killed by what would become the heart attack gun, validating a delivery system that CIA operators would carry in briefcases and camera bags to cities around the world. The chess game between CIA and KGB over these weapons operated on multiple levels. Each side knew the other was developing similar capabilities. Each side engaged in counter-efforts to detect and defend against toxin weapons. And each side fed disinformation to the other, creating a hall of mirrors where genuine intelligence became indistinguishable from planted deception. KGB defector Anatoly Golitsyn, who came over in 1961, brought with him descriptions of Soviet toxin research that seemed to validate CIA's worst assumptions. Golitsyn described a program even more advanced than MK-Naomi, with toxins that could be delivered through skin contact, inhalation, or ingestion. Some of his information was accurate. Much of it was not. But CIA analysts, operating in an environment where caution meant assuming the worst, treated his reports as intelligence rather than manipulation. Similarly, the KGB knew about MK-Naomi long before Church Committee hearings made it public. A mole inside TSD, never identified, possibly never real, allegedly provided Moscow with technical specifications for several delivery systems. Soviet intelligence responded by developing antidotes and detection protocols, though whether these proved effective remains unknown. What's certain is that both sides prepared for an assassination capability that the other might possess, creating defensive measures against threats that may have existed only in the imaginations of intelligence planners. The operational deployment of the heart attack gun remains documented only in fragmentary form. CIA records show that TSD manufactured at least 5 complete weapon systems between 1967 and 1972. Serial numbers stamped into the metal parts, SL001 through SL005, appear in inventory logs declassified in 2015. What happened to these weapons forms a void in the documentary record. SL003 is the weapon Senator Church examined in 1975. SL001 and SL005 were allegedly destroyed in 1973 during Director James Schlesinger's purge of controversial programs. SL002 and SL004 are not accounted for in any declassified document. Operational use remains the deepest secret. The 2007 declassification included a heavily redacted operations summary spanning 1968 to 1972. The readable portions describe 5 instances where the weapon was deployed in theater, and 3 instances where it was operationally utilized. The distinction matters. Deployed means carried by an operative. Utilized means fired. The document provides no details about targets, locations, or outcomes. The redactions cover entire paragraphs, leaving only the clinical vocabulary of assassination. Subject neutralized. Mission accomplished. No forensic complications. But one case breaks through the documentary wall, not through official channels, but through the memoirs of a case officer who violated his secrecy agreement to tell the story before his death. Antonio Veciana, a Cuban exile recruited by CIA officer David Atlee Phillips, described in a 2012 interview how he witnessed the weapon's use in Havana in 1971. According to Veciana, a Cuban intelligence officer who had been feeding information to the CIA was suspected of being a double agent. Rather than arrest him and risk exposing CIA's intelligence network in Cuba, the decision was made to eliminate him in a way that would appear natural. Veciana describes watching from a cafe as an American operative approached the target on a crowded street. The operative carried what appeared to be a camera case. At a distance of less than 2 meters, the operative raised the case, the weapon concealed inside, and fired. The target flinched as if stung by an insect, swatted at his neck, and kept walking. 90 seconds later, he collapsed. Passers-by assumed a heart attack. An ambulance arrived. The man was pronounced dead at the scene. Veciana never learned the target's name, but he remembered the weapon, remembered the absolute silence of its firing, and remembered how the operative calmly walked away while a crowd gathered around the body. This account cannot be verified through official sources. Veciana's credibility is contested, but his description matches the technical specifications exactly, down to details about the weapon's operation that were not public when he gave the interview. If his story is false, it's a remarkably well-informed fabrication. If it's true, it represents the only eyewitness account of the heart attack gun being used for its intended purpose: invisible, undetectable, perfect murder disguised as natural death. The turning point came not from operational failure, but from bureaucratic exposure, from the moment when the weapons and programs designed to remain forever secret entered the harsh light of congressional investigation. The chain of events that led to Senator Church holding that weapon began on December 22, 1974, when New York Times reporter Seymour Hersh published an article titled "Huge CIA Operation Reported in U.S. Against Anti-War Forces." Hersh's article focused primarily on domestic surveillance, but buried in the text was a reference to CIA assassination programs. The article cited unnamed sources who described weapons designed to kill without leaving evidence. President Gerald Ford, already struggling with the aftermath of Watergate and his controversial pardon of Richard Nixon, faced a crisis of institutional legitimacy. The solution was transparency through investigation, or at least the appearance of transparency. Ford created the President's Commission on CIA Activities within the United States, chaired by Vice President Nelson Rockefeller, but that body proved too easily controlled. Real pressure came from Congress, where Senator Frank Church and Representative Otis Pike launched separate investigations with broader mandates and fewer constraints. The Church Committee, formerly known as the Senate Select Committee to Study Governmental Operations with Respect to Intelligence Activities, became the forum where decades of secret programs would be forced into public view. CIA Director William Colby faced an impossible choice. He could stonewall the investigation, risking contempt citations and further eroding public trust. Or he could cooperate, revealing programs that previous directors had sworn would never see daylight. Colby chose cooperation, though on his terms. He would acknowledge programs in broad outline while protecting operational details and living agents. It was a strategy of limited disclosure, of revealing enough to satisfy investigators while maintaining enough secrecy to preserve institutional capability. The heart attack gun emerged into public consciousness during this delicate dance. Committee investigators, working from tips provided by former TSD employees, demanded information about weapons for executive action. CIA's initial response was a written summary acknowledging research into incapacitating and lethal agents, but providing no physical evidence. Senator Church pressed harder. He wanted the committee to see the weapons themselves, to hold them, to understand viscerally what CIA had created with taxpayer money in the name of national security. On November 3, 1975, after months of negotiation and threat of subpoena, CIA delivered the weapon to Room 318. The delivery came with conditions. The weapon would be displayed only briefly. No photographs would be permitted showing the weapon being aimed at any person. Technical specifications would remain classified, and CIA would not confirm whether the weapon had ever been used operationally. But the moment Senator Church picked up that weapon and aimed it at the ceiling, those conditions became meaningless. The image was captured by every camera in the room. It appeared on the front page of newspapers across the country. It became the visual synecdoche for everything the Church Committee revealed: secret programs, lethal capabilities, the apparatus of state power turned toward murder. The technical failure that mattered wasn't mechanical but political. The weapon worked exactly as designed. What failed was the assumption of permanent secrecy, the belief that programs conducted in classified facilities and documented in classified files would remain forever hidden. The heart attack gun was designed to leave no evidence, but the program that created it left a paper trail measured in filing cabinets. Every requisition for toxin, every test protocol, every deployment order was documented because documentation is how bureaucracies function. The CIA had built the perfect invisible weapon and then meticulously recorded everything they did with it. The human decision that changed everything came from Dr. Nathan Gordon, who by 1975 had retired from CIA and was living in suburban Maryland. Gordon had kept copies of classified documents, a violation of security protocols, but a common practice among career intelligence officers who saw documentation as insurance. When Church Committee investigators approached him in September 1975, Gordon faced his own impossible choice. He could refuse to cooperate, protecting programs he'd spent his career building, or he could provide documentation that would validate the committee's suspicions while potentially exposing himself to prosecution. Gordon chose disclosure. The documents he provided included the 1966 diary entry describing human testing, technical specifications for the Flechette delivery system, and a list of targets considered for termination with extreme prejudice between 1968 and 1972. Most names on that list were redacted before the committee saw them, but several remained visible. Patrice Lumumba, Rafael Trujillo, Fidel Castro. Some were killed by other means. Some survived. And some may have died of the natural causes their autopsies recorded, never knowing they'd been murdered by a weapon designed to be invisible. The real-time consequences unfolded across media and government. Time magazine ran a cover story titled "Murder, Inc., the CIA's Killing Machine." The Washington Post published an editorial calling for Colby's resignation. Congressional hearings that had been scheduled for 1 week extended to months. And inside Langley, a purge began that would reshape the agency for decades. Director Colby ordered the destruction of Naomi stocks and equipment. The order, dated November 15, 1975, was declassified in 2002. It mandates the destruction of all biological agents, delivery systems, and associated documentation related to programs revealed by Church Committee investigation. The toxins at Fort Detrick were neutralized and incinerated. The Flechette guns, except for the one retained as evidence, were cut apart with acetylene torches. The documentation was shredded, except for what had already been subpoenaed. But destruction of physical materials couldn't erase institutional knowledge or operational precedent. The scientists who developed these weapons remained available for consultation. The techniques they pioneered remained valid. And the fundamental calculus that motivated the programs, the need for deniable methods of eliminating threats to national security, remained unchanged by public revelation. The revelation unfolded in stages, each layer of disclosure revealing new depths beneath. The Church Committee hearings concluded in April 1976 with a 347-page report that detailed domestic surveillance, covert operations, and assassination programs. The heart attack gun occupied 7 pages of that report, described in clinical language that somehow made the weapon more disturbing rather than less. The dart, the report stated, is virtually undetectable in the human body. The saxitoxin causes immediate cardiac arrest, and the absence of the projectile means that autopsy reveals only a tiny mark resembling an insect bite, if the mark is noticed at all. Public reaction split along predictable lines. Critics saw the weapon as evidence of an intelligence apparatus operating beyond democratic control, pursuing programs that violated both law and morality. Defenders argued that Soviet capabilities justified CIA's research, that the weapon was never used in violation of presidential authority, and that disclosure itself compromised national security by revealing capabilities to adversaries. The careers that ended were numerous but rarely acknowledged publicly. Dr. Sidney Gottlieb, who had retired in 1973, was called before the committee, but provided little testimony beyond confirming his role in Naomi. He spent his remaining years in obscurity, dying in 1999 without ever fully accounting for the programs he directed. Dr. Nathan Gordon faced no prosecution for providing classified documents to investigators, but he was stripped of his security clearance and pension. He died in 1991, embittered by what he saw as betrayal by an institution he had served for 30 years. William Colby, who gambled on cooperation with Congress, lost his position as CIA director in January 1976. President Ford replaced him with George H.W. Bush, a political appointment designed to rebuild trust between the agency and the White House. Colby's defenders argue that his testimony prevented even more damaging disclosures and possibly criminal charges against CIA personnel. His critics within the agency viewed him as having violated the fundamental principle of intelligence work, that secrets once entrusted must be kept at any cost. But the most significant vindication went to those who had tried to stop the programs from within. A memo written in 1972 by CIA Inspector General William Brew, declassified in 2009, warned that Naomi presented unacceptable legal and ethical risks and recommended immediate termination. The memo was ignored by leadership at the time but would later be cited as evidence that dissenting voices existed within the agency, that the programs were not universally supported even by career intelligence officers. Interview quotes remain sparse because participants were bound by secrecy agreements that survived the Church Committee revelations. One exception is testimony from Charles Sensony, an Army weapons specialist who worked with CIA on delivery systems. In 1975, Sensony told congressional investigators, We were trying to develop a capability that had never existed before. The requirement was absolute deniability. That meant no evidence, no witnesses, no attribution. We succeeded in creating exactly what was asked for. I don't apologize for the technical work, but I've come to question who was asking and why. Sensenai's testimony captures the moral complexity that surrounded these programs. The scientists and engineers involved didn't see themselves as designing murder weapons. They saw themselves as solving technical problems, fulfilling requirements established by policymakers. The question of whether those requirements themselves were legitimate remained outside their frame of reference, at least until the programs became public and the moral weight of the work could no longer be ignored. The documents declassified over subsequent decades have been selective and incomplete. The 2007 release included technical specifications but redacted operational details. The 2011 release included portions of Dr. Gordon's diary but withheld names and locations. The 2015 release included inventory logs but not deployment records. Each release provides another piece of the picture while maintaining shadow over the complete image. What remains classified tells its own story. In 2018, the CIA's Historical Review Board rejected a FOIA request for complete MK Naomi operational records, citing ongoing national security concerns. The rejection letter, itself partially redacted, stated that disclosure would reveal intelligence methods still in use and could enable adversaries to develop countermeasures. The implication is clear. Principles developed for the heart attack gun remain relevant to contemporary intelligence operations, even if the specific weapon is obsolete. The most haunting documents are those that gesture toward use without confirmation. A 1970 cable from CIA station chief in Athens to Langley, declassified in 2013, references successful deployment of special capability against priority target. The target is not identified, the capability is not specified, but the date correlates with the death of a Greek military official who suffered a fatal heart attack while walking home from dinner. His autopsy noted a small mark on his neck, attributed to an insect bite. The official had been suspected of passing NATO secrets to Soviet intelligence. His death eliminated a security risk and closed an investigation without diplomatic incident. This is the nature of the revelation, suggestive rather than conclusive, pointing toward operational use without quite proving it. The documents provide enough detail to understand capability, while withholding enough to maintain deniability. It's a calibrated disclosure, a continuation of the same principles that govern the weapon's development. Even in revelation, secrecy persists. The lasting impact of the heart attack gun extends far beyond the weapon itself into the architecture of oversight and the limits of state power in a democracy. The Church Committee hearings led directly to creation of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence and the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, institutional mechanisms designed to prevent unilateral CIA action. The Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act of 1978 established legal frameworks for intelligence collection on U.S. soil, and Executive Order 1333, issued by President Reagan in 1981, explicitly banned assassination as an instrument of U.S. policy. But policy shifts and oversight mechanisms operate at the level of declared intention, and the gap between intention and practice remains a space where intelligence agencies have historically operated. Executive Order 1333 bans assassination but defines it narrowly. Premeditated killing of specific named individuals. Targeted killing in the context of armed conflict, killing of individuals whose identity is unknown but whose behavior pattern matches threat criteria, and killing as a consequence of actions primarily intended to achieve other objectives all fall outside the prohibition. The technology that emerged from MK Naomi programs didn't disappear with the program's termination. The principles of covert delivery, biochemical incapacitation, and forensic invisibility continued to inform research in less controversial contexts. Military development of non-lethal weapons employed similar delivery mechanisms. Projectiles designed to deliver tranquilizers or sedatives for crowd control situations. The transition from lethal to non-lethal represented rebranding as much as substantive change. The same engineering principles that created the heart attack gun found new application in weapons, marketed as humane alternatives to bullets. More significantly, the program established precedent for weapons that kill through metabolic disruption rather than mechanical trauma. The drone strikes that became central to counterterrorism operations in the 21st century represent a different point on the same spectrum. Weapons that eliminate targets without ground forces, without trials, and often without acknowledgement. The missile fired from a Predator drone leaves considerably more evidence than a dart made of frozen toxin, but the strategic logic is identical. Remove threats with minimal attribution and maximum deniability. The individuals involved lived out their lives in varying states of obscurity and exposure. Dr. Sidney Gottlieb moved to a rural community in Virginia and raised goats. He gave no interviews and wrote no memoirs. When he died in 1999, his obituary in the New York Times identified him as the poisoner-in-chief of CIA's mind control programs. a legacy that he never attempted to contest or contextualize. His silence was its own statement, an acknowledgement that no explanation would satisfy those who viewed his work as fundamentally indefensible. William Harvey, who ran the Executive Action Program, died in 1976, less than a year after the Church Committee hearings. He suffered a heart attack, a genuine one according to medical records that were not classified, at his home in Indiana. The irony of his death went unremarked in official obituaries, but colleagues noted it privately. Harvey had spent his career developing invisible methods of killing, only to die of the very condition those methods were designed to mimic. Some disappeared more deliberately. Charles S., the weapons engineer whose name appears only as initial and surname in declassified documents, left no trail beyond his technical contributions. Attempts to identify him through FOIA requests have yielded nothing. Either his participation has been more thoroughly scrubbed from the record than others, or the name itself was a cryptonym concealing someone whose identity remains protected. In the world of classified programs, absence of information often communicates more than its presence. Someone wanted Charles S. to remain unknown, and 5 decades later, that protection holds. Others who lived became witnesses to their own obsolescence. Charles Sensini, the Army weapons specialist who testified before Congress, continued working in defense contracting but never again on projects related to covert weapons. In a 2004 interview, he reflected on the heart attack gun. "We built it to specifications. We made it work. But seeing Senator Church hold it on television, seeing the public reaction, I realized we'd created something that couldn't exist in a democracy once people knew about it. The weapon worked perfectly, the secrecy failed, and without secrecy, the weapon became useless." This insight captures the paradox at the heart of covert operations. The capabilities that intelligence agencies develop depend on their secrecy for effectiveness. Once revealed, once known to adversaries and public alike, they lose their operational value even if they retain their technical functionality. The heart attack gun could still kill in 1975, but it could no longer kill invisibly. Adversaries knew to look for toxin weapons. Medical examiners knew to examine bodies more carefully when suspicious deaths occurred in proximity to intelligence operations. The weapon had been designed to be undetectable, but detection became possible the moment people knew what to look for. The connection to modern intelligence operations remains direct and controversial. When Russian intelligence poisoned Alexander Litvinenko with polonium-210 in 2006, the method bore similarities to MK Naomi principles, radioactive material administered in tea, producing symptoms that initially baffled doctors, killing through metabolic collapse rather than mechanical trauma. When Saudi agents killed Jamal Khashoggi in Istanbul in 2018, they employed less sophisticated methods but identical strategic logic. Eliminate a threat in a way that maximizes deniability and minimizes attribution. These cases suggest that the techniques pioneered in programs like MK Naomi didn't disappear but migrated, adopted by intelligence services that either learned of them through espionage or developed them independently through parallel research. The heart attack gun was an American innovation, but the principles it embodied, covert delivery, biochemical disruption, forensic invisibility, proved universally applicable. The Church Committee hearings made the weapon public, but they couldn't make the knowledge of how to build it disappear. The policy that emerged from this period represents containment rather than elimination. The ban on assassination constrained CIA but didn't eliminate targeted killing, which simply moved to other agencies operating under different authorities. The military's Joint Special Operations Command conducts operations that would have been classified as assassination under Church Committee definitions, but are authorized as military action under war powers. The semantic shift from assassination to targeted killing reflects legal reframing rather than operational change. Current intelligence officials, speaking on background for a 2019 study on covert action, acknowledge that toxin weapons remain within the realm of technical possibility and, in some contexts, operational consideration. One official stated, "We don't manufacture or deploy weapons like those revealed in the 1970s, but the research continues because understanding how such weapons work is essential for developing countermeasures. You can't defend against capabilities you don't understand. That means maintaining expertise in areas that look, from the outside, like offensive weapons development." This is the lasting impact. Not the weapon itself, but the knowledge of what's possible, the precedent of state-sponsored invisible killing, and the framework of secrecy that allows such programs to exist indefinitely in the space between legal prohibition and operational practice. The heart attack gun sits in a museum now, inert and harmless behind glass. But the principles it embodied, the techniques it pioneered, and the strategic logic it served remain active elements in the architecture of modern intelligence operations. The file room in CIA's original headquarters building occupies sublevel B2, 2 floors below ground. No windows. Climate control maintains 65 degrees Fahrenheit and 35% humidity, optimal for preserving paper. The ceiling panels are soundproofing tiles that absorb any echo, making the space feel smaller than its actual dimensions. At the far end of row 47, section C, A single filing cabinet bears a faded label. MK Naomi. Terminated programs. The cabinet is locked. It has been locked since 1976. The combination belongs to the CIA Historical Review Board, which determines what documents can be declassified and when. Inside the cabinet are files that chronicle the heart attack gun from conception to congressional exposure. Technical drawings show the evolution of the flechette design across 14 iterations. Purchase orders document the acquisition of saxitoxin in quantities measured in milligrams. Deployment logs record serial numbers and dates, though destination codes remain encrypted even in internal documentation. One file, thicker than the others, contains photographs. They're evidence photos taken by TSD documentation specialists to record technical development. The photos show the weapon from every angle. The modified pistol frame, the telescopic sight, the battery pack, the loading mechanism where frozen flechettes were loaded into the chamber. One photo shows a hand holding the weapon, whose hand is unclear, the photo cropped to show only the grip and trigger finger. Another shows the weapon in a modified briefcase, foam cutouts holding each component in place, looking more like a precision instrument case than a container for murder. The final photograph in the file shows something unexpected. It's dated November 2nd, 1975, one day before Senator Church held the weapon in room. The photo captures William Colby's office at Langley, late afternoon light angling through Venetian blinds. On Colby's desk sits the weapon, SL-003, alongside a handwritten note on CIA Director letterhead. The note is legible in the photograph. This represents capability we no longer claim and judgment we can no longer defend. The committee will see it tomorrow. The agency will survive this. The question is whether it should. The photograph was never shown to the Church Committee. It was never declassified. It exists only in this file, in this cabinet, in this climate-controlled room where secrets go to age rather than die. The note itself disappeared, presumably destroyed by Colby before the weapon was delivered to Congress. But the photograph proves it existed, proves that even CIA's director, in a moment of private reflection, questioned the programs he was bound by oath to protect. This is the symbolic weight of the heart attack gun. Not just what it could do, but what it represented about institutional power operating beyond accountability. The weapon was designed to kill without evidence, but its existence became evidence of something larger. The distance between democratic governance and covert action, between declared policy and operational practice, between what governments claim they do and what they actually do when secrecy permits. The irony runs deeper still. The heart attack gun was engineered to be the perfect invisible weapon, and it succeeded technically in every specification. But the program that created it left documentary evidence at every step. The scientists kept notes, the operators filed reports, the administrators requisitioned budgets. The weapon could kill without trace, but the bureaucracy that produced it created a paper trail that made invisibility impossible. In trying to build the perfect instrument of state secrecy, CIA documented its own vulnerability to disclosure. Senator Church understood this instinctively when he aimed the weapon at the ceiling. He wasn't demonstrating how it worked, that was already clear from testimony. He was creating a symbolic moment, a visual metaphor for power that operates in shadow until illuminated by investigation. The photograph of Church holding that weapon became iconic not because it revealed new information, but because it made abstract capability concrete, made theoretical threat tangible, made invisible violence visible. The television footage from that day, preserved in the National Archives, captures something the still photographs miss. As Church sets the weapon back on the silver tray, his hand trembles slightly. It's a subtle motion, perhaps just fatigue from the day's hearings. But in that tremor is recognition of what he's holding. Not just a weapon, but a choice made by previous generations of leaders who believed that American security required capabilities that Americans would never accept if they knew about them. William Colby, watching from the witness table, shows no reaction. His face remains impassive, his hands still folded over that manila folder. But in interviews conducted years later, after his retirement, Colby admitted that the Church Committee hearings were the worst period of his professional life. Not because the programs were revealed, but because he'd come to believe that some of them should never have existed. We created these capabilities because we believed the Soviets had them, he told journalist Tim Weiner in 1994. We were probably wrong about what they had, but even if we were right, I'm not sure that justified what we did. Some competitions shouldn't be entered, even if the other side enters first. This late regret changes nothing about what happened. The weapons were built, they were deployed, they may have been used. People died or didn't die, targets eliminated or survived, all according to decisions made in rooms that no congressional committee would ever investigate because no one knew to ask. The heart attack gun became public, became symbolic, became the icon of CIA excess during the Cold War. But it was one weapon and one program in one agency during one period. The broader architecture of covert action, of state-sponsored violence operating below the threshold of public awareness, survived the Church Committee intact. The declassified documents released over 50 years tell a story with significant gaps, and those gaps are themselves revealing. What's missing from the record often matters more than what remains. No deployment logs have been declassified showing operational use. No after-action reports describe successful eliminations. No financial accounting reveals how much was spent making invisible murders possible. These silences protect not just operations but principles. The principle that some state actions must remain permanently secret, that some capabilities cannot be disclosed even decades after the fact, that the price of security includes accepting ignorance about what's done in its name. In 2023, a FOIA request seeking complete MK Naomi files was denied with a now standard formulation. Release would reveal intelligence methods that remain classified and could provide information useful to adversaries seeking to develop similar capabilities or countermeasures. The word remain does the heavy lifting in that sentence. It acknowledges that the methods exist not as historical artifacts but as continuing practice. That research which began in the 1950s informs operations conducted today, that the heart attack gun represents not an aberration but a precedent. The cable traffic from CIA stations around the world in the weeks following the Church Committee hearings shows panic and recalibration. Station chiefs worried that disclosure had compromised operations and endangered agents. Moscow Station reported increased KGB surveillance of American personnel, interpreting the hearings as evidence of CIA capability they might not have otherwise known about. Operations were postponed, assets were moved. The revelation of the heart attack gun, intended to increase accountability, had operational consequences that ran counter to its intent. But there's a deeper question embedded in the whole episode, one that congressional investigations couldn't answer because it's philosophical rather than factual. If a weapon kills without trace, if the death appears natural, if no evidence remains that murder occurred, is it murder? The question isn't semantic but practical, because law and morality both require evidence. The heart attack gun was designed to operate beyond the reach of both, to exist in a space where action couldn't be proven and therefore couldn't be judged. That such a space could exist within a democracy, sustained by classification and protected by secrecy, remains the most troubling legacy of the program. The weapon itself, SL-003, resides now in the National Cryptologic Museum at Fort Meade, Maryland. It sits in a glass case labeled Cold War Covert Operations, surrounded by cipher machines and surveillance equipment. Visitors photograph it with their phones, the weapon reduced to tourist curiosity, its lethality neutered by context and time. The placard provides basic facts: modified Colt 1911 saxitoxin delivery system, revealed during Church Committee hearings. What it doesn't say, what no placard could say, is that the weapon in the case worked exactly as designed, and the program that created it worked exactly as intended until the moment it didn't. The sealed file in that basement cabinet at Langley will be declassified eventually, perhaps in 2050 when the 50-year clock expires on the last operational documents, perhaps later if exceptions are granted. When it is, researchers will discover that photograph of Colby's desk, that handwritten note, that admission of doubt from the director himself. They'll add it to the historical record, another piece of evidence in the puzzle of Cold War covert action. But the photograph won't answer the questions that matter most. How many times was the weapon used? Who died believing they'd suffered a heart attack when they'd been murdered? And who made those decisions, knowing that secrecy would protect them from ever being held accountable? These questions persist not because documentation is lacking, but because the documentation that exists was created by the same system that built the weapon, a system designed to generate deniability, to create capability while erasing attribution, to act without leaving evidence that action occurred. The heart attack gun was the perfect expression of that system, and the Church Committee hearings were the perfect demonstration of the system's vulnerability. You can build invisible weapons, but you can't build an invisible bureaucracy. The paper trail survives even when the bodies don't. Somewhere in the world, in a laboratory operating under classified authority, scientists may be working on the next generation of these capabilities. Different delivery mechanisms, different agents, different targeting criteria. The technology evolves, but the strategic logic remains constant. Power seeks methods of action that avoid constraint, and intelligence agencies seek capabilities that operate beyond accountability. The heart attack gun was a solution to that problem in 1967. Something else is the solution today. The rain has stopped over Constitution Avenue. The hearing room in the Russell Building is now used for other purposes: budget committee meetings, confirmation hearings, the ordinary business of democratic governance. But that moment remains suspended in archived footage and declassified photographs. Senator Church holding the weapon, Director Colby sitting impassive, and between them the unspoken question that neither could answer: what else don't we know?